Today, I'm making a face hugger. What could go wrong? For this build, I used EVA foam, craft foam, generic Halloween decorations, such as bones, and a skeletonized snake. You can find these things everywhere right now, and I have no idea why, because isn't a live cobra infinitely scarier than a dead one? Am I crazy? I mean, I am, but is this really why, honestly? I mean, I see this and I'm like, oh, it's a skeleton snake. I saw a live snake the other day just out in the woods, and for a split second I was like, the f is that? And then I was like, oh, it's just a garter snake. You know, I don't get that split second. Am I about to die with a skeleton of anything? Anyway, this one was $6.50. Paint, super glue, hot glue, cutting tools, sanding tools, safety gear, scissors, razor pens, and a box cutter. First, I made the lobes by cutting them out of white foam floor mats. I used an old helmet template as a reference. I think this is like an earpiece. I'm not exactly sure what template this is from, but it's a very rough reference. This is the general shape, and it's gonna get refined a lot. I flipped it, I traced it, and I cut one out for the other side with scissors and a razor pen. Although you don't actually need a razor pen, I think, at all on this build. I mean, it's helpful, but with organic stuff, you don't have to be as precise. So it's a lot of leeway. There's a lot of wiggle room for this build. And I ended up modifying it later because at second glance, these came out a little too big. But people's faces come in all shapes and sizes, so, you know, do what works best for you. I trimmed those down, and then using scissors, I trimmed off the entire outside edge of those kidney beans. This is not pretty. It's just because I know that eventually I'm gonna have to sand that edge until it's rounded so that it looks organic. And that'll kick up a lot of dust, so like trimming the corner off, that's gonna cut away at least 60% of the dust. Maybe that's not a big deal to a lot of you, and count yourself lucky. I seem to have a perpetual hay fever going on. I'm not sure if you could tell. And sure, the belt sander swing arm is cool, but it means I have to redesign my dust collection system. So, you know, I don't have a lot of wiggle room. I keep getting requests for a shop tour, and yeah, I get it, but the shop's not done yet. I'm still building it. Will it ever be done? I don't know. Or like Tantalus, am I trapped in a hell of my own making? I don't know. I like it. I don't think Tantalus had a mini fridge. I set those aside for now and then moved on to the central portion of the face hugger. Oddly enough, it ends up being smaller than the lobes because it's really just a central truss that everything attaches to, and it's going to be covered up by a bunch of organic details later. For that centerpiece, I used the mouth portion of the Deadpool mask as a stencil because it's designed to sit over a mouth anyway. I'm actually using an offcut from the original Deadpool build. I would have used the template, but I can't find it. Like all hoarders, I'll never admit that I have a problem, but I will concede I have lost props as big as my Stormtrooper costume, fully assembled on the mannequin because it was buried under other props. That's the state of my prop storage situation at the moment. Do with that what you will. I need shelves. Also, I have not done a shop tour yet. It's not in a state to be toured. I wonder if I could get a gig on that hoarder show. I wonder what they pay. I cut it out and checked it against the lobes. I smoothed out the rough edges on the belt sander. Okay, now that looks way more organic, but they're still flat. So I'm gonna need to round those out. I did that by heating them up with this heat applying machine. Hooray, algorithmic monitoring of closed captioning. We're totally not living in an Orwellian nightmare. To the newbies, just ignore my kvetching. Ignore me! I rounded it out on a hard surface before letting it cool inside a giant novelty Easter egg. Contrary to popular belief, this is not the same one from every other build. The old one was co-opted for an atomic prop. It was actually just a background prop in the last video. I don't even think it was on screen for more than a second, like a literal second. 24 frames. Then I utilized the same heat process for the mouth covering. When it cooled, I glued the seams together with super glue. This will help them retain their curved shape, despite being only one piece. Although eventually by the end of this whole project, this mouth covering will be covered up, so you could possibly get away with skipping the heat forming process since no one's gonna see it. But I mean, it's like 15 minutes of work, so I figured I'd just do it. Now to attach the lobes. First I glued shims to the inside so that they would flare out a bit more, otherwise the space for the wearer would be too narrow. Then I glued them on. I don't know why I'm using hot glue right here. Super glue would have been a little bit better, but I'm recording this in the future and it's held up so far, so do with that what you will. Next I drilled a hole for the tail using a pipe. Would have been a little bit easier if I'd done this before heat forming, but that one got away from me as well. See, this is what happens when you don't plan a build. William Shakespeare, making the mistakes so you don't have to. Next I made the structures that the fingers attach to. The knuckles. It's just the back of the palm of the hand. So I made those, and I cut one out, and then flipped it to get the opposite side. Next I heat formed the pieces. Unlike the previous heat formed pieces, these ones are just a little bit too small for me to hold on to without burning my fingers. So I skewered it on a kebab skewer to hold it away from my hand. When it was hot, I formed it the same way as the other parts. Then I superglued them to the central piece. And this is what it should look like. Or should it? I did a test fitting and discovered that the pointed part at the top kept it from sitting close enough to my face, so I had to cut that off with scissors and re-round it on the belt sander. This is why you want to do test fittings as you go. You don't want to try and fix things after you've painted it. Not to mention, I don't want to have to work on this after I've attached the fingers. I can just see them getting caught up in the belt sander. Although if it wasn't so destructive, that would be a good way to fling it across the room, you know, for like an effect shot, or playing a prank on an unsuspecting roommate. See how much better that sits? It's almost like a pilot's oxygen mask. I'm gonna make a mental note of that for later. I just feel like I'm gonna have to make a pilot helmet at some point. The hands were a little long though, so I shortened them by chopping the end off of one side and then using it as a stencil to make sure that the other one would match. Then I used foam bevels to simulate the bones just under the skin. And for those of you who are following along, if you're having a tough time finding specialized foam parts like this, then you can actually make these by sanding the puzzle strips until they're round. It just takes a little bit of time, but does it take more time than spending all day driving around to various craft stores looking for this specialized part, you know? At this point, those are the calculations I'm doing when I'm trying to get a build out on time. Also, dust. Dust is a factor. I cut one end to be slanted so that it would line up with the center part, then glued it to match the contour of the palm's edge. Then I wrapped the overhang underneath the palm and glued it down. Once it's set, I moved on to the next one. There are 4 on each hand, 8 in total. They're symmetrical. Before making the fingers, I wanted to build up the center so that it matches the extremities better. First, I put a bevel in the center so that the height would match. Okay, now this is actually kind of a waste of a bevel. So for those following along, if you're having trouble finding parts like bevels, this is going to be covered up, so you can actually just use any piece of scrap foam if you're low on bevels. Next, I overlaid it with strips of 2mm craft foam in order to make lobster-like plate armor. This isn't structural, so I can get away with hot glue. Also, hot glue looks organic when it dries, so that's a plus. I think on one of my xenomorphs, I actually used hot glue for the gums once. It's hard to keep track. I've made multiple xenomorphs. Hashtag maker problems. I just applied these strips one after the other, slightly overlapping, and when I was done, it covered the whole center portion. Now for the actual fingers. To save time, I'm using Halloween decoration bones, which should be in abundance right now. But if those aren't available to you, I'll have another method for making finger bones later. These ones are the closest matching that I could find, but they're still not perfect. They're a little bit too long, so I chopped them in half, and since they're hollow, I was able to set one inside the other, collapsing them inward like a radio antenna or a spyglass. And I cleaned up the seam a little bit on the belt sander. This is actually kind of a waste of organic shapes, I realized, because I only got 3 segments, and I'm gonna need 24 in total. So for the next 3, I cut them in half, and instead of setting them one inside the other, I built a new socket on the end of each half. This way I could get 6 segments. A few of them I could get away with just breaking in half because, like actual bones, old plastic becomes incredibly brittle. Now, being cheap plastic, they have a very visible seam, so I whittled that off with the razor pen. To make the sockets, I'm using golf tees because I don't think golf's for me, you know? I don't think I'm gonna miss these. Despite this solution, I still found myself a few segments short. So here's another method of making facehugger fingers. I cut a section of foam dowel and trimmed the ends. Then I used a work knife to flay the sides, thus narrowing them. Now that's pretty rough, so I smoothed it out on the belt sander. It occurs to me that you could use lengths of wooden dowels instead of foam, and the same methods would work. They just take a little bit more elbow grease. But that will make the fingers less flexible and necessitate the use of much more durable hardware at the joints. And that's just, if you have time, go for it. I just had a lot going on this month. Okay, now see the difference? I saved the offcuts from before and glued them to the creature at the joints to create even more organic variation. Just a minor detail. Now to attach all the finger segments. Initially I was going to use armature wire, which is actually what it's for. It allows puppets to be posable and hold the pose. But since this is a mixed media project, I decided to go with bent up paper clips. Those will just skewer right into the foam, but for the plastic bones, I had to drill a hole. And I added a little bit of hot glue in between the joints to act like cartilage. Once they were all together, I attached them to the parasite one at a time. I skewered the exposed metal into the foam, and once it was in all the way, added the hot glue. As you no doubt can tell, there are massive color variations between the plastic fingers, the foam body, and the foam segments, especially where there's exposed masking tape and yellow foam spacers. I suspected DRD was here, so I'm gonna have to paint it. The facehugger, not the DRD. Too late for 1812 though. I have to have a custom paint stand for this project, and what better than a face? Still though, paint will dissolve styrofoam, so I covered it with the drop cloth, and hey, accidental spooky ghost tutorial. Then I took it outside to paint. So you may notice that I haven't added the tail yet, and that's because, much like xenomorph blood, the aerosol and spray paint will corrode the rubber of the snake tail. Not as dramatically, but it's just gross. It'll make the surface somehow tacky and slimy. So I'll have to wait until after the painting process to attach it. Now the spray paint fumes are incredibly harmful if inhaled, so definitely protect your ears above all else. Good job, Jake. Oh yeah, the wind will just take care of that. Why wear a mask while painting? It's only allergy season. Yeah, schmuck. While that's drying, I worked on the tail. First, I removed the cobra head using a screwdriver, and that's pretty much all you gotta do for that step. I thought it would take longer, actually. I still have to wait a while for the paint to dry. Guess I'll just binge alien movies. I skipped 3. Here's a test fitting. The tail has an eye bolt on the end of it, so attaching it is actually a really simple process. I just stuck it through the hole and then ran a dowel through the loop. The tension holds it in place, but I added hot glue just for good measure. Waited for it to dry, and that's it. That's how to make a facehugger. Now, if your goal is to make a stasis tank display, like in the second Alien movie, then you can pick up a glass cylinder from any craft store. They have a whole glass department. But if you're on a budget, you can also just grab a barrel of cheese puffs. Not a sponsor. And you know what? I don't want them as a sponsor. These are addictive. This is probably deadlier than the paint fumes. And that's how to make a facehugger. Oh, and if they get loose, I recommend vice grips. Thanks for watching, everybody. Do want to give a quick shout out to my patrons. Those are the names scrolling by. Their pledges support the main build. If you're interested in joining them and supporting the channel, then you can check out the links in the description down below for patron channel services, such as early uploads and limited ads. Alright, hope you enjoyed this. Don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the bell icon to be notified of the future uploads, because it's kind of at a totally random schedule. And let me know what other props you'd like to see me make in comments down below. Thanks again, happy crafting, see you later!